I always knew greed had a specific scent, but I never expected it to linger so heavily in the room where my father took his last breath. It smelled like cheap cologne and freshly printed legal paper, a sickly sweet combination that still makes my stomach turn. I am 68 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent the better part of a decade watching the strongest man I ever knew slowly lose his battle with time. My father was a man of the earth, a builder, a pragmatist who believed in honest sweat and keeping your promises. When his health began to fail, there was never a question of who would step up. I moved back into my childhood home, adjusting my entire life to manage his medications, his doctor appointments, and the increasingly confusing fog that clouded his brilliant mind in his final years. It was exhausting, heartbreaking work, but I did it out of profound love and respect. Then there was my younger brother, Richard. Richard is 55 going on 25. If I inherited my father's calloused hands and quiet endurance, Richard inherited a slick charm and an insatiable appetite for things he had not earned. Richard was a phantom in our lives, materializing only when his wallet was light or when his latest get-rich-quick scheme had inevitably collapsed. He wore expensive suits bought on credit, drove leased sports cars he could not afford, and viewed our father not as a patriarch to be revered, but as a bank to be tapped. For years, my father saw right through him. He would bail Richard out of his messes with a stern lecture and a tight grip on his checkbook, always assuring me that when the time came, his estate would be handled with strict fairness. He promised me, looking me dead in the eye during one of his rare moments of total clarity, that my sacrifice would be recognized and my future secured. But in the last 6 months of my father's life, the dementia took a vicious, aggressive hold. His days became a blur of forgotten faces and paranoid delusions. And right on cue, smelling the blood in the water, Richard suddenly decided to play the role of the doting son. He started showing up unannounced, bringing cheap pastries and talking loudly about the good old days. Worse, he started demanding I leave the room so he could have private time with Dad. I should have barred the door. I should have thrown him out onto the street. But I was so terribly exhausted, so worn down to the bone from the sleepless nights and the constant anxiety of caregiving, that I welcomed the 30 minutes of quiet just to close my eyes. I did not realize my fatigue was the very weapon Richard was using to destroy me. He thought he had outsmarted us both, setting a trap I would never see coming until it was too late. He just failed to realize that the man whose mind he was manipulating had spent a lifetime building foundations that could withstand any earthquake. The day our father finally passed away, the house fell into a deafening silence. I sat beside his bed, holding his cold hand, weeping for the loss of my anchor. Richard, however, was pacing the hallway. He was not shedding a tear. He was making phone calls. I could hear the frantic, energetic buzz in his voice, the sound of a man who had just won the lottery and was already deciding which color yacht to buy. His immediate shift from a grieving son to a calculating opportunist was chilling. 3 weeks later, we sat in the sterile, mahogany-lined office of Mr. Henderson, our father's longtime estate attorney. I was still wearing my morning clothes, a heavy dark suit that felt suffocating. Richard arrived late, wearing a flashy light gray suit, grinning at the receptionist and checking his expensive watch. He took the leather chair next to me, crossing his legs and tapping his Italian loafers against the carpet. Mr. Henderson looked uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, his eyes darting nervously between me and my brother. He pulled a thick, crisp manila folder from his desk drawer. It did not look like the old, yellowed file I knew my father kept his documents in. Henderson began to speak, his voice lacking its usual authoritative resonance. He stated that for decades, my father's will had dictated a clean, 50-50 split of all assets between his 2 sons. The family home, the extensive stock portfolio, the liquid cash, everything was to be divided equally. It was what I expected. It was what was fair. But then, Henderson swallowed hard and looked down at the desk. He explained that just 4 months prior, during the exact window of time when my father was suffering from severe hallucinations, and Richard was taking his private time in the bedroom my father had supposedly requested an emergency update to his will. My heart completely stopped. The room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Henderson opened the crisp folder and read the newly amended terms. The estate consisted of the family home, free and clear of any mortgage, and just over $2 million in liquid savings and investments. According to this new, legally binding document, carrying my father's shaky, barely legible signature, the entirety of the $2 million and the deed to the house were to be left solely to Richard. I sat utterly paralyzed. My brain refused to process the words. $2 million. The house I had maintained with my own 2 hands? Gone. All of it. Handed over to a man who had not so much as carried a glass of water to his dying father. I found my voice, a raspy, shaking whisper. I asked Henderson how this was possible. I asked him how a man who did not even know what year it was could legally change his entire estate plan. Henderson looked at me with deep, genuine pity. He explained that Richard had brought our father into a different law firm, a flashy downtown office, complete with a hastily procured medical certificate from a doctor I had never heard of, declaring my father of sound mind for the exact hour it took to sign the papers. It was a perfectly executed, ruthlessly legal hijacking. I turned to look at Richard. He was not even trying to hide his triumph. He looked me up and down, a gaze filled with sheer contempt. Henderson sighed. Turning to the final page of the document, he stated there was one singular bequest left for me. The new will explicitly stated that because Arthur was already a responsible and established man, he was to receive only one item, a heavy, locked wooden cedar chest kept in the back of my father's closet, containing his personal keepsakes, a wooden box. For 10 years of my life, my health and my sanity, a wooden box. Henderson gestured to the corner of his office. There it sat, the old cedar chest. It was battered, scratched, and secured with a heavy brass padlock. There was no key. Richard stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He patted my shoulder, a gesture so patronizing it took every ounce of my self-control not to break his jaw right there in the law office. He told me not to feel too bad, that Dad always knew I could take care of myself, and that he would send someone to clear my things out of his house by the end of the week. He walked out of the office whistling. I was left sitting in the silence, staring at the chest. I felt hollowed out, betrayed not just by my brother, but seemingly by the father I had worshipped. I walked over to the chest and hoisted it into my arms. It was incredibly heavy, feeling like a coffin from my forgotten years. I carried it out to my old truck, my mind racing with anger, grief, and a desperate, burning sense of injustice. I did not know what was inside that locked box, but as I drove away, staring at it in my rearview mirror, a strange, undeniable instinct began to wash over me. Richard had orchestrated a flawless robbery, blinding himself with greed and arrogance, completely unaware of the terrifying power resting quietly on the passenger seat of my truck. I thought losing my father was the deepest wound I could ever endure, but watching my brother dance on his grave proved me completely wrong. The ink on the forged will was barely dry before Richard began the systematic erasure of our family's history. He moved with a speed that disgusted me, a frantic rush to convert memories into cold, hard cash. Less than 4 weeks after the funeral, a massive wooden sign was hammered into the front lawn of the home I had bled to maintain. He sold our childhood home to a corporate developer for a quick cash offer, completely indifferent to the fact that they planned to bulldoze the sturdy brick structure to build a cluster of cheap townhouses. He drained our father's lifelong accounts, liquidating the painstakingly built stock portfolio and the retirement bonds, funneling over $2 million directly into his own personal checking account. I was unceremoniously evicted, forced to pack my meager belongings into a rented van and relocate to a cramped, second-floor apartment on the noisy, industrial side of town. As I watched the demolition crew bring in the heavy machinery to tear the roof off our childhood home, a strange thought gnawed at the back of my mind. My father was a brilliantly cautious man who never put all his eggs in one basket, and Richard was blindly gorging himself on the visible harvest without ever bothering to check the soil beneath it. Richard did not just buy a new house with his stolen windfall. He bought a massive monument to his own arrogance. He purchased a sprawling, ostentatious mansion in a highly exclusive, newly developed gated community known as Whispering Pines. It was the kind of pristine, artificial neighborhood where the entry gates were guarded 24 hours a day by men in tailored blazers, and the sweeping driveways were paved with imported, perfectly cut cobblestone. The house itself was a monstrosity of modern architecture, all floor-to-ceiling glass, sharp metallic angles, and cold white marble. It looked less like a home and more like a corporate lobby, entirely devoid of warmth or character. 5 months after my humiliating eviction, a thick envelope arrived at my dingy apartment. It was a heavy, gold-embossed invitation to Richard's official housewarming gala. My initial, visceral instinct was to tear the card in half and throw it directly into the trash can. But my aunt, one of the few extended relatives still speaking to both of us, called me relentlessly, laying on a heavy, suffocating guilt trip. She insisted I go, crying over the phone, reminding me that Richard was the only immediate family I had left in this world. Against my better judgment, and driven by a morbid, painful curiosity to see exactly what my stolen inheritance had purchased, I put on my best, admittedly outdated Navy suit and drove my rusted truck out to Whispering Pines. I felt like an alien stepping onto a hostile planet. The valet attendees rushed to hide my old, dented truck from the glittering lineup of European sports cars and luxury SUVs. Inside, the mansion was absurdly lavish, a desperate scream for validation. Uniformed waiters carried silver trays of expensive caviar and imported champagne. A live string quartet played in the corner of a living room the size of a high school gymnasium. Richard was holding court near a massive, custom-built stone fireplace. He wore a plush velvet dinner jacket, his face flushed with alcohol and the intoxicating, dizzying high of unearned wealth. When he spotted me standing uncomfortably by the grand foyer, his eyes lit up with a malicious, predatory glee. He walked over, clapping me heavily on the back, a gesture that felt more like a strike than an embrace. He practically dragged me by the arm toward a group of wealthy, sophisticated investors he was desperately trying to impress. He raised his crystal glass, his voice booming over the polite, hushed chatter of the room. He introduced me as his big brother, Arthur, the retired civil engineer. He told them, with a sickly sweet condescension dripping from every word, that I lived a simple, quiet life in a tiny apartment on the wrong side of the tracks. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the marble floors, asking the wealthy crowd if it was not just so humble and quaint of me to come admire how the other half lives. The investors offered tight, uncomfortable smiles, shifting their weight awkwardly. I stood there, my hands clenched into tight fists inside my jacket pockets. My jaw locked so hard my teeth ached. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene or give him the satisfaction of an outburst. I simply endured the public humiliation, my stone-cold silence serving as a stark contrast to his loud, desperately insecure boasting. For the rest of the agonizing evening, I retreated to the shadows of the expansive patio, observing the train wreck in motion. I watched him snap his fingers to order around the catering staff like they were peasants. I mentally calculated the exorbitant cost of the crystal chandeliers, the imported Persian rugs, the absurd, meaningless modern art hanging on the vast white walls. He was spending money with the reckless, frantic abandon of a man who did not know the value of a single hour of hard labor. He was bleeding the $2 million dry with every passing hour, entirely consumed by his own grand illusion. I left the party early, feeling physically ill and profoundly hollow. The drive back to my modest apartment was agonizingly slow, the bright city lights blurring through my windshield. When I finally unlocked my door and walked inside, the silence of my small living room felt incredibly heavy. I turned on a single, dim floor lamp, and there, sitting in the corner exactly where I had placed it months ago, was the heavy, locked wooden cedar chest. I had ignored it entirely, treating it as a painful, mocking reminder of my father's supposed final betrayal. I had convinced myself it held nothing but worthless trinkets, old black-and-white family photographs, tarnished military medals, perhaps a few of his favorite wooden smoking pipes. I viewed it as a pathetic, empty consolation prize handed out by a thief. But the bitter taste of humiliation I was forced to swallow tonight sparked a fierce, dark resolve deep in my chest. I was finally ready to face whatever meager scraps my father had left me, entirely unaware that the old man's brilliant, vindictive masterstroke had been resting silently in my living room this entire time. I walked into my cramped kitchen, opened the bottom utility drawer, and pulled out a heavy steel crowbar and a solid steel claw hammer. I walked back into the living room and knelt on the worn, fraying carpet in front of the cedar chest. I wedged the cold, flat edge of the crowbar firmly under the heavy brass padlock. I raised the hammer high above my head, took a deep, shaky breath, and brought it down with all the pent-up rage, grief, and profound betrayal of the past 6 months. The padlock shattered with a sharp, violent metallic crack, the broken pieces falling heavily to the floorboards. I tossed the tools aside. My hands were trembling slightly as I placed my palms flat against the cool wood of the heavy lid. I braced myself for the past, grabbed the iron handles, and pulled the chest open. I expected to find nothing more than a graveyard of forgotten memories. But the stale air trapped inside that old wood carried the distinct, electric charge of a long-buried secret. As the heavy lid creaked backward on its rusted iron hinges, a familiar scent wafted up into the dim light of my cramped apartment. It was the smell of my childhood, a comforting blend of sweet pipe tobacco, aged leather, and the sharp, clean scent of cedar. I knelt on the floor, the anger that had been boiling inside me for 6 months suddenly replaced by a profound, suffocating wave of grief. I reached inside, my hands trembling slightly as I brushed my fingers against the top layer of items. There were my father's old, worn-out leather work gloves, permanently molded to the shape of his strong, calloused hands. Beside them sat his tarnished silver pocket watch, the one he checked every single evening when he came home from the construction sites. I found a neat tied stack of letters, the paper yellowed and fragile, written by my mother during the early years of their marriage before she passed away. Tears, hot and heavy, finally spilled over my cheeks. For hours, I sat on my frayed carpet, pulling out these beautiful, simple fragments of a deeply honorable life. Every item I touched was a stark reminder of the man my father truly was. He was a man of immense integrity, a man who valued hard work and loyalty above all else. The glaring contradiction between the father I knew and the man who supposedly signed away my entire livelihood to a greedy, absentee son gnawed at my soul. As I brushed my fingers over his tarnished military medals, a heavy, unsettling thought crossed my mind. My father never kept anything under lock and key unless it possessed a value far greater than sentiment alone. I cleared out the last of the photographs, carefully stacking them on my coffee table, expecting to see the solid, raw wood of the chest's interior bottom. I pressed my palms flat against the base to hoist myself up from the floor, but something felt entirely wrong. The wood beneath my hands did not feel dense or solid. It gave way slightly, producing a hollow, echoing thud. My heart began to race against my ribs. I grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen and shined the bright beam directly into the empty chest. I ran my fingers along the edges of the bottom panel, pressing firmly against the corners. In the back right corner, hidden perfectly by the shadows, I felt a tiny, almost invisible indentation. It was a finger notch. I grabbed the flat edge of my steel crowbar and wedged it carefully into the tight seam. I applied a gentle, steady pressure, and with a soft scraping sound, the entire false bottom of the cedar chest popped completely loose. I lifted the wooden panel away, tossing it aside. Resting quietly in the hidden, shallow compartment beneath it was a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was sealed shut with a thick puddle of dark red wax, bearing the distinct heavy imprint of my father's old signet ring. My breath hitched in my throat. I pulled the envelope out, feeling its substantial weight. I did not hesitate. I broke the wax seal, the brittle red flakes scattering across my lap, and pulled out the contents. There were exactly two things inside. The first was a handwritten letter on my father's heavy, cream-colored stationery. The second was a dense, intimidating stack of legal and corporate documents bound tightly together by a heavy black metal clip. I unfolded the letter first. My eyes scanned the top of the page. The date written in the corner was from exactly 2 years ago, long before the aggressive dementia had ever begun to cloud his brilliant mind. The handwriting was firm, deliberate, and undeniably his. He started by telling me how deeply he loved me, and how profoundly grateful he was for the sacrifices he knew I would inevitably make for him in his final days. He wrote that he could feel his memory beginning to slip, small moments of confusion that terrified him, and he knew his time as the master of his own mind was coming to an end. Then, the tone of the letter shifted dramatically. The ink seemed to press harder into the page. He wrote about Richard. He stated with chilling clarity that he knew exactly who his youngest son was. He knew Richard was drowning in debt, living a life of pathetic vanity, and waiting like a vulture for the inevitable end. My father wrote that he fully anticipated Richard would try to manipulate him, to coerce him, or to find some slippery downtown lawyer to forge a new will the moment his mental defenses dropped. I read the next paragraph 3 times, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer, undeniable genius of the man I had mourned. My father explained that if he tried to fight Richard through a traditional, ironclad will, Richard would simply tie up the estate in a brutal, agonizing probate battle for a decade. Richard would bleed the estate dry with lawyer fees just to spite me out of my fair share. So, my father decided to do the exact opposite. He decided to let Richard think he had won. He intentionally left the liquid cash and the physical house vulnerable, knowing Richard would gorge himself on the bait without ever checking the jaws of the trap. My father wrote that true wealth was never about the cash in the bank, but about controlling the very ground upon which your enemies tried to build their kingdoms. He ended the letter with a simple, commanding instruction read the documents. Call Marcus and take back what is rightfully yours. I set the letter down on the floor, my hands shaking violently, a profound sense of vindication washing away 6 months of bitter agony. He had not betrayed me. He had protected me. I picked up the thick stack of legal documents. I am an engineer, not a lawyer, but the bold, capitalized headers on the pages were clear enough for anyone to understand. They were the official, state-certified incorporation papers for a private holding company. The documents proved the company had been quietly established over 10 years ago. I flipped to the ownership ledger. The sole acting president, the controlling shareholder, and the absolute owner of this holding company was listed plainly in black ink. Arthur. I turned the page to the asset declaration. The holding company did not hold stocks, or bonds, or liquid cash. It held exactly one singular asset. It was a property deed for a massive, sprawling tract of undeveloped land located on the wealthy north side of the county. Attached to the deed was a highly complex commercial ground lease agreement signed by a major corporate real estate developer. I stared at the geographical coordinates printed on the heavy paper. A cold, sharp realization slowly dawning on me. I recognized the zoning boundaries. I recognized the nearby highway intersections listed in the surveyor's notes. It was the exact same tract of land that had recently been transformed into the highly exclusive, gated community known as Whispering Pines. My father had quietly purchased hundreds of acres of prime real estate a decade ago, placed it into a ghost corporation entirely in my name, and leased it to the developers. Richard had proudly shown off his marble floors and crystal chandeliers tonight, completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality resting quietly in my hands. He owned the expensive bricks, but I owned the very dirt beneath his feet, and the lease was entirely on my terms. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. I lay awake all night staring at the peeling paint on my bedroom ceiling, my heart pounding with the terrifying thrill of a man holding a loaded weapon he never knew he owned. The heavy manila envelope rested on my cheap nightstand, radiating a heat that seemed to warm the entire cramped apartment. The moment the sun finally broke over the gray, industrial skyline, I grabbed the documents, practically ran down the stairs to my rusted truck, and fired up the engine. I was driving toward the only man in the city I knew possessed the legal teeth to help me tear my brother's illusion to shreds. Marcus was an old bulldog of a real estate attorney. He was 70 years old, possessed a voice like grinding gravel, and had been a fiercely loyal friend to my father for over 3 decades. When I walked into his cluttered downtown office at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, carrying the thick envelope under my arm, he took one long look at my bloodshot eyes, told his secretary to hold all his calls, and immediately locked his heavy oak door. I sat down in the cracked leather chair across from his desk and spilled the documents onto the blotter. I told him everything. I recounted the agonizing reading of the forged will, the swift, brutal eviction from my childhood home, and the sickening display of arrogant wealth I had been forced to endure at the massive mansion in Whispering Pines the night before. Marcus listened in total, unbroken silence, his jaw clenched tighter and tighter, his bushy eyebrows furrowing deeper with every humiliating detail I shared. Then, he put on his wire-rimmed reading glasses and began to examine the corporate charter and the dense lease agreement I had pulled from the false bottom of the cedar chest. I sat there with my hands folded tightly in my lap, watching his eyes dart rapidly across the heavy legal paper. For 20 agonizing minutes. The room was so profoundly quiet, I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of his office. Suddenly, a low, rumbling sound vibrated deep in Marcus's chest. It started as a hum and erupted into a booming, genuine laugh. He leaned back in his chair, pulling his glasses down to the bridge of his nose, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He looked at me with a mixture of profound awe and deep respect. He told me that my father was not merely a pragmatic builder. He was a strategic mastermind who had orchestrated a flawless, devastating legal checkmate from beyond the grave. Marcus laid the thick stack of papers out flat and began to translate the suffocating, dense legal jargon into plain, undeniable facts. He explained that when the wealthy, aggressive developers wanted to build the ultra-exclusive Whispering Pines community 10 years ago, they desperately tried to buy my father's massive tract of land. They offered him millions in cash, but my father absolutely refused to sell the dirt. Instead, operating through the anonymous shell corporation he had quietly placed entirely in my name, he forced the developers into a highly complex, ironclad commercial arrangement known as a 99-year ground lease. My breath hitched in my throat as Marcus broke down the terrifying reality of the trap. He explained that the developers were legally permitted to pave the grand driveways, pour the massive concrete foundations, and construct the luxurious, sprawling mansions. They could then sell those physical structures for exorbitant sums to wealthy, arrogant buyers exactly like my brother. But the actual earth beneath those mansions, the very ground supporting their imported marble floors and crystal chandeliers, remained entirely under the ownership of my private holding company. Richard truly believed he was a king ruling over an untouchable castle, but legally, he was nothing more than a glorified, long-term tenant paying invisible rent to a faceless corporate landlord. And I was the sole president of that corporation, possessing absolute, uncontested authority over the land his house occupied. But the sheer brilliance of my father's vengeance did not stop there. Marcus pulled a specific, heavily modified addendum attached to the very back of the master lease agreement. He tapped his thick index finger against a paragraph highlighted in faint yellow ink. He looked up at me, a sharp, predatory glint in his eyes, and asked if I knew exactly which specific piece of property Richard had purchased in the sprawling neighborhood. I swallowed hard, visualizing the sheer size of the obnoxious estate resting at the very top of the hill. I told Marcus it was the premier property, the highest elevation with the grandest view in the entire development. Marcus nodded slowly, a dark smile spreading across his weathered face. He pointed directly to the document and stated that my father had forced the developers to accept a unique, heavily customized set of rules specifically governing lot number 7. It was the exact premium hilltop lot Richard had been loudly, obsessively bragging about for years. Every time Richard came to a family dinner and arrogantly boasted about how he would one day buy the crown jewel of the new development to prove his superiority, my father had simply listened quietly, filing the information away to construct the perfect snare. Marcus read the specific clause aloud, and the words hit me like a physical shockwave. For lot number 7 alone, the landowner possessed the unilateral right to trigger an immediate, massive rent escalation, or absolutely terminate the ground lease entirely, if the property owner violated a strict, uncompromising set of moral and financial conduct rules. The clause explicitly prohibited creating public nuisances, facing financial insolvency, or engaging in any actions that would severely damage the exclusive reputation of the neighborhood. I sat completely frozen in my chair. The massive implications washed over me in heavy, crushing waves. Richard was currently throwing lavish, drunken parties, alienating his wealthy neighbors, and burning through the stolen $2 million at a terrifying, reckless speed. He was already dancing blindfolded on the edge of a massive cliff, entirely unaware that I was the one holding the safety line, ready to cut it at a moment's notice. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the desk, his voice dropping to a low, serious whisper. He told me that Richard owned the expensive bricks and the imported windows, but I owned the very foundation holding them up in the sky. If I chose to enforce the hidden clauses of this lease, I had the absolute legal power to make the ground beneath his feet completely uninhabitable. I could bankrupt him with skyrocketing fees, or I could force him to surrender the massive physical mansion directly to my holding company for pennies on the dollar just to escape the crushing legal penalties of the land dispute. The raw, intoxicating power of the situation left me entirely breathless. For 6 agonizing months, I had felt entirely powerless, a pathetic victim of my brother's ruthless greed and my own misplaced, foolish trust. I had accepted my miserable fate in a dingy apartment while he drank champagne in a palace bought with my stolen sweat. Now, sitting in that dusty downtown law office, the suffocating weight lifted off my chest. I realized I was not the victim at all. I was the architect of his impending, absolute ruin. I looked at Marcus, the lingering, bitter pain of my father's death finally merging with a cold, hardened resolve. I asked my old friend what our very first move should be to spring the trap. Marcus grinned, pulling a fresh, yellow legal pad from his desk drawer, entirely aware of a critical financial trigger Richard was inevitably going to hit. He began writing out a formal corporate notice, a small, seemingly harmless administrative audit regarding backdated association fees that would serve as the first, quiet tightening of the noose around my brother's neck. There is a specific kind of rot that happens when a man builds a kingdom on stolen gold. It always starts silently at the foundation before it brings down the towering walls. I knew Richard's inevitable collapse was coming, but I severely underestimated just how fast his own unbridled arrogance would accelerate the demolition. 8 months passed since the agonizing night of that sickening housewarming gala. During that time, the $2 million, which should have been more than enough to secure a comfortable, quiet retirement for both of us, was evaporating like water thrown onto a hot iron skillet. I kept close tabs on him through Marcus, who possessed a vast network of local financial gossips and banking contacts. Richard was bleeding cash at an astronomical rate. He had purchased 3 imported sports cars he rarely drove, took lavish, month-long vacations to Europe to impress his shallow circle of friends, and dumped hundreds of thousands of dollars into a flashy, doomed technology startup run by a group of wealthy grifters he met at a country club. Inevitably, the well began to run dry. His massive estate required a terrifying monthly burn rate just to maintain the sheer illusion of immense wealth. The property taxes, the exorbitant utility bills for a house that size, the landscaping crews, and the 24-hour security fees were eating him alive. To keep the bright lights on and the expensive champagne flowing, Richard made his first truly fatal mistake. He applied for a massive, high-interest second mortgage against the mansion. He assumed the grand house was completely free and clear. A giant marble piggy bank he could simply smash open whenever he needed a fresh infusion of capital to fund his rapidly sinking lifestyle. He had absolutely no idea the bank was legally obligated to thoroughly verify the title of the property, which inevitably led their underwriters straight to the complex ground lease. That was the exact moment I instructed Marcus to strike. Operating entirely behind the opaque, impenetrable shield of our anonymous holding company, I told Marcus to enforce a strict, microscopic legal audit of the master lease agreement attached specifically to lot number 7. The trap sprang shut with a deafening silence. The bank froze Richard's mortgage application instantly, sending him a terse notice citing a severe cloud on the title and an unresolved land use dispute with the primary deed holder. Then came the letters. Marcus sent them via certified mail, printed on heavy, intimidating corporate letterhead from the holding company, demanding an immediate signature upon delivery. The very first letter was a formal, uncompromising notice of severe financial delinquency. When Richard originally bought the physical house from the developers, he was so blinded by his own ego and the shiny marble floors that he completely ignored the dense fine print regarding the massive annual ground lease fees. The contract explicitly stated that the homeowner owed the landowner a substantial fee every single January. Richard had skipped the payment entirely, assuming it was a simple clerical error or a paltry homeowners association due he could easily brush off with a phone call. The holding company hit him with a staggering bill for $150,000 in back rent. Even worse, the sum was compounded by vicious, legally binding late penalties that my father had explicitly designed to multiply like a relentless virus the longer they were ignored. Richard had absolutely no idea that the harder he fought the faceless corporation, the tighter the legal snare would wrap around his remaining, dwindling assets. I started driving out to the Whispering Pines development on Sunday evenings. I would park my rusted truck just outside the massive iron main gates, blending into the shadows where the men in tailored blazers could not chase me away. I watched his glittering castle from afar, witnessing the rapid, glorious decay of his stolen empire. The grand, obnoxious parties completely stopped. The massive crystal chandeliers in the front foyer went dark as he clearly began rationing his electricity. The expensive, professional landscaping crews stopped showing up, leaving the pristine, perfectly manicured lawns to grow wild and overgrown with ugly weeds. The shiny European sports cars vanished from the sweeping cobblestone driveway one by one, quietly repossessed by aggressive lenders in the dead of night. Richard was beginning to sweat, but his frantic desperation was about to push him toward a catastrophic public meltdown that would finally give me the exact legal ammunition I needed to execute the final, devastating blow. He started making frantic, screaming phone calls to his bank, demanding access to the equity in his house, entirely unaware that the very brother he had rendered homeless was the one systematically freezing his accounts. He hired a cheap, aggressive local lawyer to send threatening, blustering emails to Marcus, claiming the ground lease was predatory and illegal. Marcus simply filed the emails away in a thick folder, letting Richard waste thousands of dollars in legal fees fighting a ghost he could never possibly touch. The stress was visibly eating my brother alive. Word trickled back to me through Marcus that Richard had tried to sell some of the expensive modern art he bought for the house, only to discover the pieces were practically worthless on the secondary market. His wealthy, sophisticated friends, the same people he had paraded me in front of to mock my modest life, completely abandoned him the second the free drinks stopped flowing. He was entirely isolated inside a massive, echoing fortress of his own making, drowning in a sea of past due notices and aggressive collection calls. I sat in Marcus's dusty office one rainy Tuesday afternoon, reviewing the latest financial intelligence. Marcus slid a bank rejection letter across the desk, grinning from ear to ear. Richard's credit lines were officially tapped out. His savings accounts were completely drained. He was trapped in a financial vice grip, completely paralyzed by the brilliant foresight of a father he had severely underestimated. I looked down at the documents. A deep, profound sense of poetic justice settling comfortably into my bones. For almost a year, I had endured the bitter, stinging pain of his betrayal. I had swallowed my pride, living in a cramped, noisy apartment, trusting that my father's final act of protection would eventually bear fruit. Now, the harvest was finally ready. Richard's arrogant facade had completely cracked, revealing the terrified, incompetent child hiding beneath the velvet dinner jacket. His kingdom was rapidly collapsing, not by fire or physical force, but under the quiet, suffocating weight of paper, ink, and a patience he never possessed. I looked up at Marcus, tracing the edge of the certified mail receipt with my thumb. The time for audits and warning letters was officially over. It was time to pull the ground right out from under him. A man backed into a corner will always show you his true nature, and Richard was about to put on a spectacular, public display of his own unraveling. The financial walls were finally closing in, transforming his once glittering sanctuary into a suffocating, marble-lined prison. The final nail in his financial coffin arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning. Through his extensive network of local bankers, Marcus confirmed that Richard's desperate plea for a second mortgage had been officially, permanently denied. The bank's underwriting department had sent a blunt, uncompromising letter citing a severe and unresolvable cloud on the title. They explicitly pointed to the massive, unpaid ground lease fees and the active, aggressive legal dispute with our anonymous holding company. Richard was completely cut off. His premium credit cards were maxed out, his cash reserves were completely dry, and he could not borrow a single dime against the massive house he so proudly called his own. The stolen $2 million was entirely gone, vanished into the thin air of his own vanity. I sat across from Marcus in his dusty downtown office, watching the old attorney prepare the final, devastating document. It was not just a bill for back rent anymore. It was the ultimate legal weapon my father had buried deep within the fine print. Marcus drafted a formal, uncompromising notice of absolute lease termination. He cited the gross negligence of payments, the deliberate violation of the financial solvency clauses, and the absolute breach of the community standards my father had meticulously insisted upon for lot number 7. The document was beautifully, efficiently ruthless. It gave Richard exactly 30 days to either pay the hundreds of thousands of dollars he owed in compounded penalties and back rent, or vacate the premises entirely, legally surrendering the massive physical structure to the landowner as collateral for the breached contract. The delivery of that certified notice triggered an explosion so violent it sent shockwaves through the entire pristine neighborhood of Whispering Pines. 2 nights later, Richard attended the monthly Homeowners Association meeting held at the lavish community clubhouse. He did not go to ask for help from his neighbors. He went to start a chaotic, unhinged war. A reliable contact of Marcus's, who sat on the community board, gave us the full, humiliating account of the evening. Richard stormed into the elegant, wood-paneled meeting room looking completely disheveled. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled, his tie was loose, and his face was flushed purple with absolute, uncontrollable rage. He interrupted the polite, hushed discussions, screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding the board reveal the identities of the corporate vultures trying to steal his home. He ranted wildly about conspiracies, aggressively accusing his wealthy neighbors of plotting against him because they were secretly jealous of his massive hilltop estate. He shattered a heavy crystal water pitcher against the polished mahogany table, completely terrifying the very people he had spent the last year desperately trying to impress. His sophisticated, wealthy facade was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, pathetic screaming of a spoiled child whose toys were finally being taken away. I wondered if he had any inkling just how much worse his public humiliation would become once he realized the exact identity of the man holding the leash. After his disastrous, bridge-burning performance at the clubhouse, Richard directed his unhinged fury directly at Marcus's law firm. He spent the entire weekend leaving a continuous barrage of aggressive, arrogant voicemails on Marcus's office answering machine. Marcus played them for me on speakerphone the following Monday morning. a grim smile playing on his weathered face. Richard's voice was heavily slurred, alternating rapidly between arrogant, baseless threats and sheer, breathless panic. In one message, he promised to hire a massive team of ruthless downtown litigators to sue our holding company into total oblivion, loudly bragging about the millions he supposedly still had in reserve. In the very next breath, his voice would crack, and he would beg for a small extension, desperately claiming a massive, imaginary business deal was just days away from closing. He sounded utterly broken, entirely consumed by the terrifying reality that his perfectly executed robbery had purchased nothing but his own spectacular ruin. Marcus let the frantic voicemails pile up for a full week, intentionally letting Richard sweat in the agonizing, suffocating silence of his cold, dark mansion. We wanted him completely exhausted, completely drained of his arrogant bluster before we dragged him out into the harsh daylight. Finally, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Marcus dictated a short, incredibly polite email to Richard's cheap, completely overwhelmed local lawyer. Marcus formally agreed to an in-person mediation meeting to settle the ground lease dispute once and for all. He strictly stipulated that the meeting must take place at his own downtown law office, and that the anonymous president of the holding company would be in full attendance to finalize the absolute surrender of the property. Richard eagerly accepted the invitation within the hour, completely blinded by his own inflated, indestructible ego. He undoubtedly believed he could walk into that conference room, flash his signature charming smile, and aggressively bully some faceless, spineless corporate executive into backing down. He thought he was walking into a standard negotiation to save his stolen kingdom, completely unaware of the devastating, airtight documentation waiting for him in Marcus's desk drawer. He had no idea he was actually walking into an execution chamber, perfectly designed by the brilliant father he had betrayed, and operated by the older brother he had callously discarded. I picked up my father's old, tarnished pocket watch from Marcus's desk, listening to its steady, relentless ticking, knowing the exact hour of my brother's absolute reckoning was finally at hand. The heavy oak door of Marcus's conference room felt like a dam holding back a massive, destructive flood, and I was the man quietly holding the sledgehammer. I adjusted my tie, knowing the 2 pieces of paper resting face down in front of me were about to strip away the absolute last remaining shreds of my brother's manufactured reality. I sat completely still at the head of the long, polished mahogany table. I was dressed in the very same outdated, heavily worn navy suit I had worn to my brother's obnoxious housewarming gala 8 months prior. The sweet, burning irony of the wardrobe choice was not lost on me. Marcus sat to my right, his thick hands folded peacefully over his yellow legal pad, his face carved from unyielding stone. The antique grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy, rhythmic sounds echoing through the tense, silent air of the law office. The door swung open so violently it bounced hard against the wall. Richard marched in, carrying the frantic, twitchy energy of a completely cornered animal. He was flanked by a nervous, profusely sweating man in a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit tightly clutching a faux leather briefcase. Richard looked absolutely terrible. The custom-tailored velvet dinner jackets and the imported silk ties were entirely gone. He wore a rumpled, lightly stained dress shirt without a jacket. Heavy, dark bags sagged deeply beneath his bloodshot, terrified eyes. The stress of the past month had seemingly aged him a decade, draining the youthful, arrogant glow right out of his face. Yet, despite his obvious, severe financial decay, he still desperately tried to project the commanding aura of a billionaire. He did not even look toward the head of the table at first. He threw his heavily scratched leather portfolio onto the polished wood and immediately began barking at Marcus. He demanded to speak to the corporate executive in charge, threatening massive, ruinous lawsuits, loudly throwing around complex legal buzzwords he clearly did not understand. He slammed his fist down, demanding an immediate end to the harassment, aggressively claiming he was a man of immense wealth and profound influence who would not be bullied by a rogue holding company. Then, his rapid, sweeping gaze finally locked onto me. He froze completely. The aggressive, arrogant bluster evaporated from his face for a fraction of a second, replaced by utter, paralyzing confusion, before snapping violently back into a mask of pure, ugly condescension. He sneered, his lip curling up in disgust, and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. He loudly demanded to know why his pathetic, broke older brother was sitting in a private corporate mediation room. He actually turned to Marcus and laughed, a harsh, grating sound of sheer disbelief, asking if I was hanging around downtown law offices begging for a charitable handout from our father's old friends. He told me to get out immediately, stating this was high-level commercial real estate business, and I was severely embarrassing him in front of his attorney. I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. I just stared right through his hollow, terrified eyes. Marcus cleared his throat, a low, rumbling growl that instantly commanded absolute silence in the room. Marcus looked at Richard's cheap lawyer with immense pity, then looked dead into my brother's flushed face. Marcus stood up and officially introduced me. He stated, with perfect, cold, and flawless articulation, that there was no faceless corporate executive hiding in a glass skyscraper. He announced clearly that Arthur was the sole owner, the primary shareholder, and the acting president of the anonymous holding company that legally owned every single inch of dirt beneath lot number 7 in the Whispering Pines development. The color drained from Richard's face so violently and completely that I genuinely thought he was going to pass out right there on the expensive carpet. His jaw dropped open. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out. His brain simply could not process the catastrophic, impossible reality standing right in front of him. His cheap attorney frantically popped open his briefcase, desperately shuffling through loose papers, suddenly realizing with absolute horror that he had walked completely blind into a legally engineered slaughterhouse. I reached out and picked up the thick manila folder resting quietly in front of me. I slid the heavy legal document slowly across the polished mahogany. I pushed the original, state-certified deed of the land directly toward him. Next to it, I placed the master ground lease agreement, specifically highlighting the 99-year term and the unyielding moral and financial clauses specifically attached to his precious mansion. I watched his trembling hands slowly pick up the heavy paper. I watched his bloodshot eyes dart frantically over the pages, reading my name printed boldly in black ink as the absolute, uncontested authority over his entire existence. A strangled, pathetic wheeze escaped his throat. But I was not finished. I reached into my inner breast pocket and pulled out the single most devastating weapon I possessed, our father's handwritten letter, complete with the scattered fragments of the broken red wax seal. I slid the yellowed stationery gently across the table until it rested exactly inches from his trembling fingers. I spoke for the very first time since he walked into the room, my voice a deadly, quiet calm that cut through his panic like a surgical scalpel. I told him to read it. I told him to read exactly what our brilliant father truly thought of him in his final, perfectly lucid days. Richard picked up the old letter. The room was so profoundly quiet, I could hear the paper shaking violently in his hands. I watched his eyes track across the firm, deliberate handwriting. I watched him read the brutal words detailing his overwhelming greed, his pathetic vanity, and the brilliant, ruthless legal trap our father had intentionally laid out for him. I watched the profound, earth-shattering realization wash over him like a tidal wave. Our father had not been manipulated by a cheap downtown lawyer at all. Our father had intentionally used Richard's own blinding, insatiable arrogance to completely destroy him. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing minutes. When Richard finally looked up, the arrogant, flashy thief was entirely gone, replaced by a broken, terrified shell of a man. I leaned forward, resting my forearms firmly on the table, looking him directly in the eye. I calmly and methodically explained his new, permanent reality to him. I told him his stolen $2 million was entirely gone, burned away on a massive, meaningless illusion of grandeur. I told him he possessed absolutely zero leverage, zero financial equity, and zero legal claim to the sprawling empire he mistakenly thought he ruled. I informed him he was nothing more than a delinquent, financially ruined tenant deeply in default, trespassing illegally on my private land, and breathing air I legally controlled. I laid bare his complete and utter financial isolation, systematically stripping away the very last defensive layers of his pathetic, arrogant pride. I watched the realization sink deep into his bones that he was not the mastermind of a flawless robbery. He was the punchline to a brilliant 99-year joke. As his cheap attorney scrambled frantically to read the airtight lease clauses, sweating profusely under the crushing weight of an entirely unwinnable battle, I prepared to deliver the final, uncompromising ultimatum that would leave Richard walking out of that room with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back. There is a profound, almost eerie silence that falls over a room when a man's entire universe completely collapses in on itself. It is the sound of absolute, irreversible defeat. The cheap, sweating attorney sitting next to my brother finally finished speed-reading the dense pages of the master ground lease and the brilliantly engineered addendum our father had attached to lot number 7. He dropped the heavy paperwork onto the polished mahogany table, as if the pages were physically burning his fingers. He hastily snapped the brass locks of his faux leather briefcase shut, the sharp, metallic click echoing like a gunshot in the quiet office. He did not look at me, and he barely looked at Richard. He simply stood up, wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, and stated bluntly that the lease was entirely ironclad. The default was absolute, and he would absolutely not be participating in a completely unwinnable, financially disastrous legal battle for a client who could not even pay his retainer. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked out the heavy oak door, leaving my brother entirely abandoned and utterly defenseless. Richard sat completely paralyzed for a long, agonizing moment, staring at the empty leather chair beside him. Then, the dam finally broke. He erupted into a frantic, unhinged tantrum. He slammed his manicured fists against the table, his face twisted in an ugly, desperate rage, screaming that it was not fair. He yelled that he was the favorite son, that he deserved the $2 million because he had the grand vision to actually use it, and that I was nothing but a bitter, jealous old man trying to ruin his beautiful life. I let him scream until his voice grew harsh and cracked. I sat perfectly still, completely unbothered by his venom, knowing his pathetic display of entitlement was only cementing my resolve to execute the final, devastating phase of my father's master plan. When the aggressive anger failed to move me, the begging began. The rapid, humiliating shift was incredibly pathetic to witness. The arrogant, velvet-wearing millionaire completely vanished, replaced by a terrified, weeping child. He actually slid out of his heavy leather chair and fell to his knees on Marcus's expensive carpet. He clasped his trembling hands together, hot tears streaming down his flushed, wrinkled face, pleading with me to show mercy. He begged me to just sell the massive mansion and give him 20%, or 10%, or even just a flat $50,000 so he could rent a small apartment and buy groceries. He swore repeatedly that he had learned his lesson, promising to be a good, loyal brother from now on, begging me not to leave him out on the cold street with absolutely nothing to his name. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity, no warmth, and no hesitation. I told him in a quiet, unwavering voice that he had already made his choice the exact day he decided to manipulate our father's dying, clouded mind and throw me out of my childhood home. I reminded him that he had gladly watched me pack my entire life into cardboard boxes, smiling and checking his expensive watch while he stole the very foundation of my existence to buy his crystal chandeliers and imported European sports cars. I reached into my folder and slid a single, crisp legal document across the table. It was a formal deed in lieu of foreclosure, a complete, unconditional, and total forfeiture of the physical structure located on lot number 7. I told him he had exactly 2 choices. He could sign the paper, surrender the massive house to my holding company immediately, and walk away with his freedom, or he could refuse, and I would instruct Marcus to sue him into absolute oblivion for the hundreds of thousands of dollars in back rent and compound penalties. I promised him that if he fought me, I would ensure he spent the rest of his miserable life drowning in aggressive litigation and potential criminal fraud charges for the forged will. His shaking, clammy hands grabbed the heavy gold pen Marcus held out to him. Sobbing uncontrollably, his tears literally staining the heavy legal paper, Richard signed his name, officially signing away his stolen, artificial kingdom. He stood up, looking incredibly small, broken, and completely hollowed out. He walked slowly out of the conference room with absolutely nothing to his name except the crushing underwater debt on his repossessed luxury cars and a worthless wardrobe of wrinkled, unpaid designer suits. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, a massive, suffocating weight finally lifted off my chest. The long, agonizing year of profound injustice had been completely erased. I looked at Marcus, and for the very first time in 12 months, I offered a genuine, unrestrained smile. Richard always assumed I was just a bitter old man who wanted to steal his marble floors and live in his artificial palace, completely blind to the true monument I actually intended to build. I had absolutely no desire to live in that cold, soulless monstrosity in Whispering Pines. Within 30 days, operating legally through the anonymous holding company, I placed the sprawling estate on the open real estate market. Free from the toxic, arrogant energy my brother had infected it with, the massive property sold incredibly fast to a wonderful, grounded family who actually appreciated the vast space and the beautiful, sweeping land beneath it. The massive, multi-million-dollar profit flowed directly back into my absolute control, but I did not hoard the wealth. I kept exactly enough to buy myself a modest, comfortable brick home with a large, quiet garden on the edge of town, finally securing my own peaceful retirement. The vast majority of the reclaimed fortune was channeled into a deeply meaningful, lasting project. I established a state-of-the-art community center and a robust, fully funded trade school scholarship program in the heart of our city. I named the entire charitable foundation after our father. Every single year, dozens of hardworking, honest young men and women receive the vital financial support they need to learn carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work. They are given the tools to build their own sturdy foundations, entirely unaware that their bright, promising futures were directly funded by the dismantled vanity of a greedy, arrogant thief. I spend my days working quietly in my garden, reading good books, and occasionally driving past the bustling community center that bears my father's honorable name in bright, bold letters. I finally found profound, unshakable peace. My father was right all along. True power and lasting wealth are never about the flashy, expensive things you buy to impress strangers, but about the unbreakable, honest foundation you build your life upon. I watched karma systematically and ruthlessly dismantle my brother's unearned greed, perfectly replacing his toxic, hollow illusion with a legacy of genuine, lasting good. Thank you so much for watching this story to the very end. If you enjoyed watching this arrogant thief get exactly what he deserved, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends. Leave a comment down below with the word justice so I know you made it all the way through. And do not forget to hit the hype button so this video can reach more viewers who appreciate a deeply satisfying, perfectly executed lesson in karma.